Hello, attendees. We're going to give you a few minutes more to roll in. Nice to see some names I recognize, some I don't, but cool. Come on in, everybody. We'll get started in a minute. Give everyone a couple of minutes to come in. You can watch Wendy in her natural element and me in my natural element. I don't know if that's entertaining to anyone. But,
Your love top is bringing the love.
It's bringing love. I'm trying to share the love today. I'm trying to bring it to everybody. All right, we'll give people one more minute to come in. Thank you for joining everyone who's coming. You're in for some wonderful knowledge today about a tricky subject. And I want to say, and I'll repeat this, that if you have questions for people in attendance, if you have questions, please drop them into the chat. And thank you, Hermione, for your greeting. We are actually, our site, we have a land acknowledgement, which we usually put up before the event. So I thank you for acknowledging that Tongva, Chumash, and Kiz tribes, which we sit on their land. And thank you for coming, Hermione, and for also reminding us of that. And I guess we'll get going. I think people are still wandering in, but why don't we get started? I'm so thrilled to have with us today Wendy Wexel, who is an alum of NYU. She's done a lot of fundraising, in her words, a lot. But she really works at the intersection of money, power, and relationships. And those three things are inextricably intertwined. And so I'm going to turn it over to Wendy here. I'm going to keep my camera on so that I can see questions in the chat. I'm going to turn it over to Wendy and let her roll. So, Wendy.
Thank you, Nina, so much. It is such a pleasure to be here. As Nina said, I am an NYU alum, and I actually come from the acting side of NYU at the Tisch School. And, you know, something that I like to say is that everything I learned about entrepreneurship, I learned in acting school. And I think it's also very similar to fundraising because it's about embracing uncertainty and living in that uncertainty. And so I just want to say thank you for being here. My intention is that you learn something new. This is quite a tricky subject. And honestly, it's a subject that I teach not because I'm a whiz kid at it, but because it was actually quite challenging for me. And so let's just get right in it. All right. Let me just okay. So redefining, can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah,
okay,
100%.
Okay, perfect. So redefining fundraising, how to gain money and power without losing your soul. So this is quite a fun line. Actually, it came about because Nina and I was lucky enough to connect with her last June. And she said, you know, what is it that you teach? And I was like, well, it's usually around fundraising and it's how to gain money and power without losing your soul. And she's like, let's do this. Because it can be quite soul sucking. It really can be. And so this is a one-time only for my NYU compadres. And so I actually want this to be quite fun. And so I'm going to start off with a little bit of a joke. And this is actually a real story. So my mentor, at one point I had a pretty fancy fellowship at a university, and it was all around fundraising. And my mentor ran the program, and she's basically the right hand to the special envoy on for malaria and I think infectious disease for the UN. And so she's raised tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And this course that she would teach would be teaching nonprofit leaders and board directors who are C-suite individuals at companies. You know, maybe they had a company that exited, they're quite influential in their own right. And I will just say the great unifier is that none of them like fundraising. And so, and when you're on a board, I think it's a little different. Like in the for-profit world, usually, you know, your board directors are like, okay, let's like bring you around to different institutions, whether that's venture capital funds, et cetera, firms, et cetera. But in the nonprofit world, there are various committees. So you can be on the marketing committee, you could be on the governance committees, so if you're compliant, and then there's the development committee, which is fundraising, and that is always the least popular committee. That is the committee that you literally have to like push someone overboard to be on. So my mentor, you know, she was trying to rally this group of C-suite executives and leaders, and she said, you know, what are the first 3 letters in fundraising? You know, like we all know what those are. And she's like, okay, we're going to have fun. And then the response is, yeah, but what are the first 2 letters? And so, you know, it's very clear where the mic drop moment happened. And also it's very clear that this is a topic that it doesn't matter how much money you have. It's something that can really eat away at you. It's something that is really quite challenging, and it's a real pain point. And so, you know, I want us to take a new step at this, a new stab, and have it be a little bit fun. And that's not just because I want to have fun and it's, you know, Thursday night. It's also because according to the research, if we do something hard and make it more fun, we're more likely to do it. And so this is a topic that's quite intimidating. You know, I wouldn't say if you're a founder of a company, if you're a nonprofit leader, if you're a filmmaker, I wouldn't say your favorite days are like time to fundraise. And so I really want to make this as sort of approachable as possible. And so in this journey of fundraising sans soul killing, you know, we're going to attack this in 3 different areas. We're going to do the practical, which is, you know, making sure that we all have the same language. You know, what are we actually dealing with here? And ensuring that we have the same starting point, so that we can literally grow together in this topic as we move on. And then the psychological, which is the emotional experience of it. You know, at least from my experience, you know, saying I could have many techniques, and someone can say, oh yeah, you just have to like basically invite someone in for $100,000 or ask someone for $1 million, and that's all fine. But the degree of panic that would come over me in having to go through that process was the really tough part. And so we're going to really talk through that. And then the tactical, you know, which is actually my favorite piece. And that's about what are the tools and techniques that we can apply today, because ultimately all of this stuff can be quite theoretical. And I want to make sure that it's applicable and that you leave this webinar at least having one thing that you can take with you. And so before we get started, and as we're, you know, playing, I just want to set the rules of this Zoom room, because in the last 19 months, we've been in a lot of Zooms. Nina's like, yes, as the understatement of the
We're
pandemic.
all zoomed out. That is completely true. We
are zoomed out. And also it's kind of this very bizarre experience of going into a virtual space and not having the cues of how to behave. And so I just want to lay out at least how I like to teach and the kind of learning experience that I want you to have. So I will say this is going to be interactive. And so if you have a pen and paper, there will be points of reflection. So make sure you have that. The other thing that I really care about is, you know, I might be facilitating this and having an incredible co-pilot in Nina, but ultimately we're all teachers and students, and everyone's lived experience really matters. And so when you ask a question, someone else will have that question. And when you have an insight, someone might be shining a light on a perspective that someone might need to hear. And so I just want to set that tone. We will have, Nina's going to be womaning the chat. I am all about the questions. I'm really here to be of service. This is, I don't like to say this is about giving back, because I think this is about giving to the community. And that's really what I think generosity in its best form looks like. And then, this is going to be a quote unquote safe space. And I'm going to define safe space because that word is really thrown out quite a bit. And, I can't say it's confidential because this is recorded. And actually, I'm going to be telling a lot of personal stories and realizing it's going to be living on YouTube. It's just, I'm an open book and we're going to go with it. But what I can say in terms of safe space is that my intentions are good. Nita's intentions are good. I'm going to assume yours are good. And whatever question you have will be well received. Because ultimately, all I really care is that you learn something. And, this isn't like, throwing out safe space because it's, the thing to say. It's fundamental to learning and it's fundamental to creativity. If we want to create great work, we have to be okay with mistakes and like not getting it right. And so this isn't about getting it right. This is about exploring and coming into insight. And then the last thing is be gentle with yourself. So I'm going to be talking about money. I know I've had money trauma, which I'll talk about. And money touches on a lot of different topics and not all experiences are positive, whether you have it or not. And particularly if you don't, I will say there's compounding traumas that can result just from being poor, just based on the data. And so I just want you to be really gentle with yourself. And if you're cool with this, there is a chat, just put yes in the chat. I think I'm going to say yeah. Okay, Nina. I'm going to say yes. And so, we're just here to like do this together. Okay, perfect. All right. The practical. So this is really about getting to the basics of it. Perfect. I love all these responses. This is perfect. Okay. So we're going to keep using that chat function because I want to really pull out the wisdom of the group. And I know that everyone that's here has so much to offer. So why is fundraising painful? Emily, I love this. Hermione, Chateau, Yang. Yes. Why is fundraising painful? And I'll just start. It's vulnerable. You're asking for things. Nina, what do you mean by that? I'm so curious.
Oh, I mean, I personally am much better giving. I'm much better at my personality is much better suited to be the person who can give the money or the advice or the thing than it is to being the person who needs the money or the advice or the thing, a personality thing.
Yeah, it's also, there's this really big sort of leap of courage in saying what you need and then remaining silent and waiting for someone to say, can I give that to you? There's just so much courage in that. And when do we talk about money and power? Like once this is, use that chat function. I'll just say like, my experience was never, it was, and I'll get through and I'll talk about this more, but money was something that was undiscussable.
I think for artists in particular, I think like there's somehow a feeling that if you're talking about money with respect to your art, that it's making you less of an artist or less of a creative, which I think is absolutely the inversion, because I think you need resources to create, right? So I think there's a funny inherent contradiction in that.
And that brings, and that's such, there's a a little bit of, I think of a misunderstanding around these strengths and weaknesses. And the thing about generosity and giving so much of ourselves is that it's actually our strengths that break us, not our weaknesses. And so with artists, when you're giving so much and you give, it's like the ability to give and not receive is actually what breaks you and what causes you to break it and break down because you overwork it. And so, and there's also this separation of, okay, money equals bad or like money equals outsource. And so and I think we're really seeing this now with artists owning companies, is that money's ownership.
I think this is really, Erica has an interesting point in the chat too, that when we're young, we're talking about money is impolite, right? And as a result, don't know how to get into it when we're adults. And I think that's completely true. You're told it's not polite to ask how much people make, or, you know, like all that sort of thing is sort of, you know, seems sort of like, I don't know why exactly, but it does seem impolite, like rude, like breaking a social contract to talk about it.
That's such a good point. And it's also this fear of discomfort. And like, what if I make someone else uncomfortable or say the wrong thing? Mm-hmm. And what that actually does is, when we don't talk about money, is that it keeps the people in power because then it just becomes a very few group, you know, a small group of people who talk about money, and they get to keep talking about money.
And we're not separating them from their money, which is our plan, right? So we have to separate them.
And so how are we really pulling, how are we putting more seats at the table? How are we giving ourselves the power to do something that's hard? And so what is money? You know, if you know, you could put that in the chat, but there are a couple of things that money can be. Some people say money is like energy. They're like, it's an energy. It's, you know, it's a resource. It gets something done. And it's interesting, you know, when someone says that money is an energy, and we'll talk about this more later, is that language matters. And so it is by no coincidence that money is also a currency. When you think about the connections and what could be used and what can be used, it's like, oh yes, a current is literally an electric volt, you know, an electric charge, and it also something that spreads. Mm-hmm. You know, and it has a real intention behind it. And then power, you know, this is, these two intersect. And the thing about money is that it can be really, it's made up. And what I mean, you know, at one point in our lives, we were, you know, money was salt. Money, you know, money could be digital currency, and you know, in terms of cryptocurrency, money is, you know, in your bartering economy, it could be like it could be camels, right? Money is gold, silver, you know, and so it ends up representing all these different things, but the thing itself, it doesn't actually mean that much. So for example, if we were on a deserted island and everyone in this virtual space was on a deserted island, and all we had was $3 million in cash, which is like great, right? Like $3 million in cash, but on a deserted island, what are we going to do? Like, can the money go like hunt for us and like filter water and like plant seeds? You know, the most helpful thing that money can do is we can burn it. Because it's very flammable. And so it's actually, the thing itself isn't that important, but when money is useful is that when there's an exchange of value, because we can't actually trade anything unless both parties find it valuable. So if I'm at a store and I want a shirt, when I went to stores,
back in the days when we went to places, yes.
Imagine. So if I want a shirt and I value the shirt, the store owner values my money, we can exchange. And so where money gets misinterpreted is that it becomes a sign of our own personal value. and it means something bigger in terms of our of what we mean essentially, and like how we actually, what is our status in the world essentially. And that's also very related to power, and you know, this hierarchical structure. But you know, I actually think of power very differently. And so and this is power in relationships. And so much of my work is about how do you shift a power dynamic to a partnership? Because ultimately in that transformation is where you maintain your soul in this process. Because, you know, the traditional definition of power is like basically right here, ability to act or produce an effect. It's influence. It's getting someone to do something else, right? And so if someone's in power, it's easier for them to get other people to do things. They're more likely to get what they want. But I define power as how well others can honor your needs. Because it doesn't matter what position you're in, or maybe what, you know, how much money you have, or what your job title is, or maybe how many followers you have. If you can get someone to give you what you need and what you want, you have power. And that is something that in all relationships will give you power. But I don't want to say like over someone, it makes you empowered. And so that's really what matters so much. And so the thing about power dynamics and sort of this power play that happens, and why fundraising gets so miserable, because it's so much about playing into these traditional structures. And if I know when I've been raising money, it can feel really powerless because I'm relying on so many other people to behave a certain way, and I'm trying to at the same time know my place. And
can you talk a little bit more about like what that means to know your place? Because I think that's a really interesting sort of phrase. And I think it's like that, maybe feeling like you have to stay in your place is maybe one of the things that interrupts people in their ability to ask for what they need.
I think it's this idea of asking for permission. It's also, I'm actually going to get to the next slide. It's about this power structure and the words that we use. And so for example, I don't have any clients at Wexel Partners. So I technically work with women and companies, et cetera, but I don't call them clients. Because if I'm in client services, it sets up the understanding, the traditional understanding that if you pay me, I will do what you want. And like basically no matter what, like you are always right. And I call it Wexel Partners because I believe in partnerships and we both have to show up. And so when I know my place, it's don't ask for too much, you know, because then it's like, unless I have all the money, I'm the CEO, I'm, you know, what I guess the celebrity, the decision maker. It leans into this understanding that unless I'm that one individual, I have to behave a certain way and sacrifice my needs for someone else. And potentially behave a certain way that might not be true to where I thrive best. And when we're talking about keeping our souls, how are we keeping ourselves? And so it's really, how are you yourself in this process? And, you know, a lot of these words are words that are, you know, we kind of can just throw around without thinking about it, like investor, donor, influencer, but just using this idea of, you know, for example, you know, we're a team. It's very different when the CEO of a company goes out and says, look, I'm just a member of a team. I'm just part of the team. It sends a very different message to everyone versus, you know, I'm the founder, I'm the CEO. It's like, no, I'm a member of the team. It equalizes things. And it actually gives so much information into who that person is. And we're going to talk later about how we give ourselves away and why that's really important to know, especially when you're talking about the intersection of money and power. So literally when I start working with women, and I will say, you know, my work is focused on individuals who identify as women, but it could be the same if you identify as a man. Like if I'm working with you and there will be an exchange of money, you will be paying me. I say, we're partners. It's like, because otherwise, if I do not lay out and say how I see the relationship, it is going to fall into traditional power dynamics. And so it is so important at the onset of a relationship to say very clearly, this is how I see our relationship. We are partners. And it completely shifts the trajectory of how that plays out, because then both people know that they have to be held accountable. And it allows for more things to come to the surface. Okay, so we're about to enter the fun part of the psychological, the feeling bit. Any questions, thoughts that Nina, that are coming your way? Are we good to move on?
No, I think the only question I had really was, you know, I get that when you've established a relationship that, you know, then you can say we're partners, right? But what is the language then that you used when you're in that initial approach? Say you want to raise money and how do you create that dynamic from the get-go with just someone you're approaching?
So I think that's a great point. We're actually gonna get there in the tactical, but
Okay.
I lead with, I think it's so important to know what we need. And this is when this is when the soul killing doesn't happen. This is when we find salvation. I shouldn't be making religious references because I'm not a particularly religious person at all.
You already said this is a safe space, so you can make any kind of reference you want. It's all going to be taken in the right spirit.
But I say what I need from the get-go. I say, this is what I'm really looking for in a partner, or like if I'm raising money, like these are the types of people and partners we want to bring onto this project. This is what we stand for. This is what, you know, and then I literally have almost like a user manual that I send someone before I work with them. And I'm like, this is how I show up. This is how I work. This is what I put up with. This is what I don't put up with. Tell me if this is okay. If this is okay with you, then this is going to work out. But if it's not, don't worry about it. Like, you're going to find someone else who's a better fit. And so the intelligence of knowing myself and knowing what I need, and then I share that with someone. Look, for someone, it could be, what are you doing? This is crazy. But the people that I want to work with will be very receptive to it. And I was actually on a call 2 weeks ago with an institution, a funding institution. And we literally went through it on our call together. And they were like, and he said, this is like the best thing that I've ever received, because it was just like, it made it so clear.
It makes me very curious what your non-negotiables are, what you absolutely will not put up with.
We're going to get to it, because the need is so important. Because
I'm anticipating you, but that's great. I think. Yeah.
Okay. Wait, I think we have a question. Should I?
Yeah, I think, yeah. Can you elaborate more on staying in your place? And I think that, you know, I bumped on that too. So can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
So if I'm in a lower position, so let's say like, and by lower position of less power, it's like I'm raising money. Typically when you have less money, you're like, you can get into a lower, like you need more power. And so when I'm in that lower position, it's very easy for me to try and change who I am, to try and become, to please someone else. Oh,
so you mean more in staying in your place by staying true to yourself in your place, not like knowing not knowing, like, because I think there's something about like knowing your place, which has sort of a negative connotation about not getting uppity or not stepping out, you know, in any way of a box. But I think what you're saying is that know who you are, hang on to that, hold on to that tight, and know your value. Is that more what you mean?
Yes. And I'll say, like, if that's something that's complicated and hard, then you're more likely to stay in a box.
Mm.
Because if I know who I am and I am sacrificing that, then I'm also, as a byproduct, making myself smaller and like diminishing my presence and my intelligence and the value I have to offer. And everyone has enormous value to offer.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from Yanis, which is, how can we negotiate the partnership narrative, which implies equality in a hierarchical relationship, i.e. a CEO versus employees versus volunteers? I think that's a very good question. In some way, you talked about the CEO who goes from the top and says, I'm part of the team, I'm not the boss. But if you're in the lower level and you are in a hierarchy, how can you approach that partnership question?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, it's interesting and this is sort of this constant navigation of understanding where you are in the power. And so, yes, if someone is a CEO, they have to soften to sort of equalize power. And that, if you're thinking about, literally, if you want to talk to a child, it's really effective to get to their level and, and to get in their level and be like, okay, I'm on the same level with you. If I'm on technically like below a CEO, I'm not the CEO, then it's really, how do I sharpen my power? How do I speak my mind? And so that is a delicate balance, because we're going to get to it, but there's ways of like, how are you asking questions in that room? How are you making sure that your voice is heard? And also, how are you from the get-go saying what you need? And so if I'm talking, and granted, this gets very complicated in multi-tiered companies. And so I will be very forthright in that my expertise is much more like one-on-one, one-on-few, working with like big pots of money versus navigating large corporate structures. So I just want to be very upfront in that. But I
think your point about like from the beginning going in and saying, this is what I need. I'm going to remain authentic to myself. I'm going to speak up and advocate for myself, right? Those are all the steps that you can sort of commitments that you can make to yourself, right? To start.
And I'm going to get very clear on that once we get to the tactical. Okay. And we're going to be exercises, because it's like saying your needs is like a very general thing, but we're actually going to get through a reflective exercise where it's like, okay, how do I even know what I need? Okay. So because that, ultimately your needs are also the foundation for your boundaries and how you show up best. Okay. So thank you so much, everyone. Is it cool if I go on to the psychological? Yes. Okay. Amazing. Okay. So this is the emotional experience of money. So I actually really need to clarify this, because money, when I say money isn't hard, but money trauma is, the financial system has so many acronyms in it. It's been made to sound very complicated. The language is made complicated to keep people in it. And also, it's very interesting. I was very intimidated by money growing up, and I'm happy to get in, and I will get into that. It's actually coming up next. But when I realized how easy money was actually to understand, and the sign of intelligence is how much you can break something down in simple terms, and how many financial terms are made complicated, and it's with the sole purpose of keeping people out. And so I just say that in that money isn't, understanding it and talking about it actually, once again, like we can say things and it could be one thing, but the money trauma is very, very real. And I just remember when I was studying fundraising for the first time, and there was this book called The Ask. And it was like, here are the tools and techniques of like how you should ask someone for money. And it was like, I think you should consider, would you be willing to consider a donation of X, which was so passive. But even just using that language was one thing, but the emotional experience of having to say that is something else. Because look, we could have been kicked out of our homes. We could have had money used as a way of spite. It could have been a way of, your parents breaking up. It could be something where
It can be so many things.
it can be so many things. And so it takes on so many other traumas. And so our bodies can get into fight, flight, or freeze very quickly. And that's one of the things that makes this the experience of fundraising so challenging. And so it's not only how are we having tools and techniques, it's how are we also using our body and our central nervous system in a way that we can actually get through it, in a way that we can sustain ourselves. So I'm going to start, this is where we start I'm going to, talk about my dad. So this is a photo of me, yesterday. It was a very recent picture. No, this is a photo about, over 35 years ago. But I love my father. We are very close today. We have a great relationship. I've gotten to spend a lot of time with him in the pandemic, which I'm really grateful for. And I was very afraid of him growing up. And it was money got in the way of how I wanted him to love me.
How
and
so?
so I'm going to tell a story. And so
I know you got my interest. I'm all excited now.
And so like he was always, like he could never like come out to dinner or do certain things because it was always too expensive. It was always like, it was an excuse. And so just to give you a situation, and this is like a very small situation, but it's one that I remember because it would literally go from 0 to 100 sometimes. So very innocently at 7 years old, I asked my father if I could go to summer camp. And I remember being in my parents' bedroom, and my dad is obviously much taller than I was. And I just asked him this question, and I just remember the explosiveness that came out of him. And he said, he screamed. He said, "Wendy, if you go to summer camp, we're going to end up in a cardboard box on the street."
Oh.
And so to a 7-year-old me, I thought that was true.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to be safe. And I thought that I did something wrong and that I was the reason that my family was going to fall apart and that we wouldn't have what we needed. And that was something that would happen. And so money became this thing of this point of anger of I want you to love me and I want you to show up for me. And it was very much, am I worthy of my dad's love? Because he was very loving, but when money came into the equation, it would flip. Mm-hmm. And so fast forward 26 years later, this photo was actually taken in LA. So, very, very webinar appropriate. I got my first fundraising job, and the psychology follows us. So, it's just very interesting that after the central element of what money meant to me was being worthy of my dad's love, so worth, I got into a profession where the number one question you ask about someone is, what is that person worth? Mm. So I ended up judging everyone else externally on their worth instead of actually dealing with my internal sense of worth. Mm. And so what happened was that fundraising became a roller coaster because, and this is very true, right? So, if I was really, great at fundraising and I raised a lot of money, I was basically manic. It was like, because that external situation validated my worth. And when I was very unsuccessful, and I actually led an organization in Los Angeles where we went through a really tough financial time, and it was a real rock bottom moment. And it was nauseating, quite frankly, in that experience. And I just remember thinking, like, I can't do this anymore. This is such a painful process. And so I need to get to the root of whatever this is. I need to deal with my worth. because until I do, it's just nothing is going to change. And so this is the signal. And now I get to share my screen and go to Spotify, where if you have a pen and paper, and I add music to make it less awkward because, Zoom. Lo-Fi Cafe, highly recommend. I want you to get that piece of paper out and then just put in the chat when you're done. And I want you to answer the question. If you were given $10 million tomorrow, what would you finally feel? So for example, for me, it was, I would feel worthy. Could it be safety, happiness? I feel happy. I would feel confident. First, I've done this exercise a bunch, and I will say for some people, it's panic because they're not even sure what they would do with the money. And so I want you to then ask, why would you be panicking? What's behind the panic? And so just take that time. Oh, relieved. Safe. Oh, I love that. Oh, people are putting the chat. That's great. Yes.
I mean, I think like my first reaction is kind of relieved. That was the first word that came into my head. But I also think that when you talk about people feeling panic, I guess there's also would be a question of that's a big responsibility, right? Like, I think that would, my second thing would be like, okay, I'm right. Someone else, Erica wrote, she's overwhelmed. With money comes responsibility, Giannis. And I think that's right. Like my first reaction would be, oh, well, that takes a lot of pressure off, right? Now I get $10 million, right? And the second thing is, well, that's a lot of money to worry about. That's a lot of responsibility.
So it's like really what's in that overwhelm. So for some people, it's, I don't know enough about money. I wouldn't know what to do with it. I wouldn't, maybe your family would be like, people would come out of the woodwork and start contacting you. And so it's really about getting to the root of that. So it might be confidence and it might be safety. I mean, a lot of it has to do with safety. But yes, whatever money gives you, and I'm just going to do a slow fade with the music. I was telling Nina, I'm like, this is where my improv background is helpful.
Handy.
Back from from college. Okay. So it's really whatever money gives you, you must first give it to yourself. And so this is like the thing that's said again and again, but it wasn't until I was safe and I felt worthy that that I could actually handle the experience, because I wasn't always these major ups and downs. It then stabilized my nervous system, and whatever happened on the externally, so whether or not I raised money or didn't raise money, I was okay. And because the job is if you're the captain of your own ship, whether there's a hurricane or it's still waters, how are you going to get to where you want to go? How are you going to remain calm? And so much of that is dealing with that internal work before you actually have to do that big external, like going through the process of raising money. So I think we had some people come about, safety is a big one. So much, I will say, like, money is it is about safety. And it's so interesting coming back to the language of money, that one of the financial instruments is called a trust. Because it's, that idea, when you trust someone, it's safe, right? And so much of this language speaks to the dynamics of what money means to us and what it should mean to us. And
so Giannis had a question, which was, does whatever money gives you you must give to yourself, imply that only affluent people should go into fundraising? But I thought you're not talking about the actual money. You're talking about whatever the money gives you in terms of power or a sense of worth or whatever it is, identity. You have to reconcile that within yourself before you can successfully go out and ask. That's more what you're saying, right?
So like, if I would finally be happy if I had $10 million, then you need to feel happy independent of whatever money's in your bank account. Whatever, the happiness cannot be tied to the outcome, which is a very Zen thing to say, but it's true.
Well, I think it's true for an artist too, because, you have to create something and put it out in the universe and trust again that people will find it, like it, love it, right? It's an act of faith. And I think it's very much the same with saying, I'm going to, it's an act of faith to ask for money in the same way. I'm going to trust myself and what I'm bringing to the table here.
And also making sure that whatever money triggers in you is sorted beforehand.
Mhm.
So for me, it was like this idea that I wasn't worthy. For someone else, it might be, confidence, right? And so success,
Mhm.
whatever that is, I'm finally successful. I'm finally meaningful. I finally matter. And so how is that independent of whatever money you have or money you're getting?
Mhm.
Because then the ups and downs are far more bearable. And they actually just equalize.
Mhm.
Is that helpful? Did I answer that question?
I think so. Yes, I think Giannis thinks so too.
Honestly, if people, it shouldn't just be affluent people raising money, because we need more people at the table, and we need more people of all different socioeconomic backgrounds interacting with money, because unfortunately, there's just major income inequality, and that's a whole other separate problem that we can talk about another time.
Another webinar. We'll get into
different webinar. Okay, so we're going to talk about the tactical. So this is the actual, we're going to get into tools and techniques. Are we good? Any questions before I sort of get into it?
I think we're good. I am monitoring the chat.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Nina.
Yeah.
So this is a quote from cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead. And it's never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. This quote is in so many decks. It is like the most used quote to inspire people, to get people on board. And the reason it's here is because, yes, it's true, and that's why it's used, but also it highlights something that's really important in fundraising that I think makes it more approachable, which is it's not about going broader, it's about going deeper. So you actually don't need to bring on like 100 new people. You just need 5 people. And to really have those people do a lot more. And quite frankly, how you find those people is they're the ones who are already showing up. And you know this, like, and this comes up in like marketing, where the cost of acquiring a customer is a lot more than retaining a customer. Mm-hmm. It takes so much more action to bring someone new in than to keep someone close. And so when we're finding people and raising money, it's really about engaging the people we already know. But the people we already know, I should actually qualify this: who's showing up, who's giving you their resources, their connections, their learnings. These are the people that will go a lot further. And so I hope that makes it less intimidating. It's not about, oh, this person's really rich, I read about them. it's like, well, you have to find them, you have to build a relationship. It's like, it's who's already showing up. You don't need a lot, max a handful. Usually when I talk to people, they're like, there's usually 1 or 2 people. There's 1 or 2 people who are going to be exponentially more helpful. Honor those people. Mm-hmm. And so I'm actually going to take a step back. And before I get into relationships when money and power intersect, I just want to talk about relationships overall. What makes for successful relationships? So it could be, it could be trust. Like, what are those elements that really make a beautiful relationship?
Communication we have in the chat.
Yes, communication, trust, kindness, responsibility. All of this is so true. And I'm going to actually say something a little different. Okay. So this is my mnemonic device because all of this is true. Yes. Trust, responsibility, kindness, communication. know your needs, express your needs, hold others accountable to those needs. Because what happens when we don't get our needs met is we get resentful, which is really a cancer when it comes to relationships. And also we keep people around who give us what we need.
Mhm.
You know, if we're not getting what we need, we sort of like, you know, I think they call this ghosting, but I don't do any of that. But it's, you know, it's like, okay, like you're not giving me what I need. Like, how can I, you know, get this person out of my life? Versus, you know, the people, if we give people the opportunity to be held accountable, the people who want to be held accountable will surprise you. We need to give them the opportunity to show up for us. And also, before we even like express that to someone, so we talked about that previously and sort of navigating those power dynamics on all sides, we need to know what that is, you know, which is like really the fundamental piece. So we're going to go back and I'm going to do a little bit of an exercise, and I'm going to put on that music because we're going to reflect together. So make sure you have that pen and paper out. Okay. So what we're about to do is an exercise that I do with, it's basically how I build strategic plans and in general, like analyze the situation, which is, you know, the positive aspects of something, you know, what works, and then the negative aspects, what's missing. And how do I compare those things? Because ultimately, within the trends lies the truth. And I need to acknowledge that Vic Harrison, the creative director of a great organization called Charity Water, she, like, I'm shifting her framework, and then it's to, but that's where it comes from. And so it's actually, you know, it's very simple. So going back in it with the pen, that's the cue. And so for the purposes of time, I would say if you could just do 2 or 3. So all we're doing is comparing, we're starting with the good, what works. So write down, ideally you want 3 to 5 because it's better to have a larger pool for comparison, but for the purpose of time, if you could just do 2 or 3, even 1. 3 to, so it's 2 to 3 situations where money and relationships intersected that worked well. So I'm gonna start with an example. So I worked with a woman earlier this year on the coaching side. Great. Literally write down what happened in that situation. So before I work with someone, I do a free discovery session, a free one-on-one. It's 2 hours. Time flew by. I really liked her. She needed guidance around how to manage relationships. That's what I knew. And it was just the right fit. So what did this person do that made the situation turn out well? Well, first off, let's talk about money. She paid me my full rate. Like that is something.
Yeah.
It's not everything, but it matters. And I think, you know, when we're talking about pay equity, like that's something that's really important. And also I believed in her and I really liked her. You know, so much of my work comes from a deep place of love. And so what is that for you? Just do it. You know, it says 3 to 5. You can do this later, but for right now, if you could even do 2, that would be helpful.
I also wanted to jump back to a question in the chat that Giannis had, because I think I'm not sure if he's got this wrong or if I've got this wrong, but he said we need to be the proverbial need whisperers and understand what the need of our partner we are going to be fulfilling. But I think you're actually saying it's differently. You're saying know your own need in the situation.
Yes. So I need to know what I need.
Right.
So, because if I don't know what I need, then I can't express it.
Right. So then we're not guessing what someone else needs. We're asking them to express clearly what they need, but we are in fact just owning what we need in the relationship.
Yeah. So because this is where like from the needs come boundaries, which we could talk about another time. But, you know, so for example, I know that I need weekends off, and that's just because I need 2 days off to reflect and like really show up well during the week. I can work late during the week, but I don't work weekends because that really affects how I show up during the week.
Mm-hmm.
So when I share that with women I'm working with, I'm like, just so you know, and there's literally a document, I don't work weekends. And then I am more likely to get what I need because I'm sharing it. And I end up working with people who are like, okay with that.
Mhm.
So it's really
And
this.
another question, when people try to negotiate down your rates, should you stand firm or be conciliatory? I think the answer to that is kind of, I
We're
understand.
it's gonna come up when we get to like what my needs are, but to me, it's it really depends. Like, I think, money is different for so many different companies and people. And so for me, it's always about partnerships. Like, money is really commitment. And it has to be a commitment for a person or a company. So my rate for Netflix would be very different than my rate for a nonprofit.
Right.
And so how I navigate those situations is I actually ask for their budget. Because if I want to do it, I'll make it work. But, but my rate this is just my perspective. Like, I'm here to be flexible, but also take advantage of who I'm talking to. Because quite frankly, if I'm talking to someone who has a lot of resources and I choose a number that might be high for me, but isn't high for them, they're going to be like, oh, why is it so affordable?
Right. Right.
Because the pricing is so relative.
Yeah. And I would say, in my work as a writer, I have taken jobs that don't pay my full rate because it was an opportunity. Either the subject matter was something I was excited about, it was a company I was interested in working with. There are a lot of reasons where you might say money is not the only thing at stake in here, and I'm willing to move.
It's not like, and we'll get to like when I talk through my needs, but like, I have to believe in you. That's the most important thing. But they could be different for you. It's really about, because it might be that money is the most important thing for you. And I want to honor that, it's not everything, but it's important to know what are your priorities. And so you can look through that between what are the situations that worked well. And then I'll get to, just for the purposes of time, what didn't work well. And so these are the painful stuff. So this is, the stuff the situations you probably remember quicker. And the reason for that is not only we have a negativity bias, but in relationships, there's great research done by John Gottman, who is a famous psychologist and sort of one of the premier experts of marriage and that relationship. And I find marriage very interesting for a couple of reasons, but mostly because it's a long-term relationship where there's a lot of different priorities and people try and make it work. It's like you're there for a while. And so how do you evolve and grow in that relationship given all these different pressures? And so he did research back in the 70s. And I will say, if you want to check him out, he's the co-founder of the Gottman Institute, highly recommend, with his wife, actually. And in the 1970s, he videotaped couples, married couples, and within just like for 15 minutes, them talking about an issue. And with 90% accuracy, he predicted who would get divorced, him and his research partner. And the reason for that is because they realized there's this magic ratio in relationships. And it's a 5-to-1 ratio. So there are 5 positive interactions for every negative interaction. So what that says is the net positive is a 5-to-1 because the negative hits us so much harder. Right, and so that's why you're like, oh my God, I remember this really bad situation. That's by, there's, I'm sure, evolutionary purposes to that, but that's also like by the structure. Like, and so when you're in relationships, it's so important to build up those positive experiences. But that, but back to this, so the negative stuff you're probably gonna remember more, but, and they're going to be more painful and they're going to be learning opportunities. And so, write down 3 to 5 situations where money and power, money relationships intersected that went awry, so not great. And so I'm gonna, you know, I'll lead by example. This is something you probably won't see coming. I went into business with my best friend. And so literally, and I will say, like, co-founder relationships are really challenging when you're talking about the intersection of money, power, and also with creatives. Like, you're both writing a script, producers on a movie. That relationship is also, requires such an emotional intelligence. So literally write down what happened in the situation. So we both quit our jobs. We moved to New York. Within 4 months, I was on the board of an organization and was voted in to lead it, and actually moved to LA and replaced another dear friend. And I couldn't handle the heartbreak, the stress, and all this new stuff that was going through, that I ended up handling it and processing my emotions through gossip. And so because I appreciated drama, my life got very, very dramatic. And I would act out on my best friend that wasn't ideal. And so what did you need but weren't getting that made it turn out badly? So I needed tools and techniques to handle my stress. And I needed a culture of no gossip, and I needed to not do it. I needed clear communication. And so what did you need for yourself? And I can bring back the music to make it, unless people have questions, or they're.
Well, we had a question from Giannis again. I understand it's of paramount importance to know ourselves and our needs. However, we need to be making partnerships when we are fundraising. So don't we need to understand our partners' needs in order to convince them to donate to our call?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely,
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's okay. So let me, yeah, no, I think it's not a one-way street. It's a two-way street. And so, yes, we do need to know what our partners also need, but, and have it. And then there's the discussion of, are we a fit?
And how do you, if you're, I think it's one thing to say, all right, I'm going to spend time and I'm going to articulate to myself what I need, and I'm going to be clear about that, right? But if you're dealing with someone who isn't as clear with what they need, how can you, in dealing with them, elicit that kind of clarity? Do you have any tips for that?
So the person I'm fundraising from doesn't really know how they show up or what they need. So this is where we're going to talk about it. It's important to pay attention, because people will reveal themselves. And so, and pay attention to what they're giving you. And also, like, if you know what you need, it's very easy to react off of that. So, so let me actually just combine for the, sort of from that exercise, what I found, what I need in professional partnership. So I must believe in the person and their mission. And then that's the most important. So yes, get paid well, right? And then the third is no gossip and be clear and communicative. Like, I'm very clear in all of that when I work with someone, and I know that about myself. If I'm dealing with someone else and they're unsure, if I'm very clearly myself, it's not going to be vanilla. Like, people are very reactive, like RuPaul is a force of nature. He's built an empire being entirely himself, and the people that aren't for him are clearly not for him. And it actually makes the filtering process that much clearer. And so it's really important that we know what I know what my partner's needs are, and respect that, and also know if that works for me. But I actually don't even think of fundraising as like, I'm raising money. I think of it as a conversation of, are we the right fit? Because there is a huge cost in accepting money. And who you take money from has a lot of repercussions and a lot of unintended consequences. And so, I think some of this might be sort of a lot of front loading, but all of, preventative care is important, because if we eat well and exercise, we're less likely to end up in the ER where the health bills are really expensive. So I'll say, how a lot of the ways that I think about the work that I do is sort of preventative care, and sort of how do we get ahead of it. because the dynamics when money's involved and we're fundraising, if I am not so clear and I don't know what I need and the other person needs, I can find myself in a situation where I can lose my soul. And this is like, once again, getting our needs met. Like, it's like, that's where we maintain our souls. And then I'm just going to run through a couple of things. Did I answer that question fully?
I think so, but I'll monitor the chat and see if anyone else wants to weigh in, but I thought that was good.
Okay, I appreciate that, Nina. Okay, so, and this is where, you know, the most powerful person in the room is the person who tells the truth. And I'm going to say that if someone's in a position that they've become quite successful, and granted, there are people that are it's very hard to talk to them. And I just want to fully acknowledge that. But most people don't want to fall flat in their faces. You know, like if someone's really telling them the truth and they're gonna want them around. With that said, if there's someone where there are very difficult rooms and it is very hard to tell the truth, this is where one of the things I think that's really important is asking it in the form of a question, because it's important, and this is true to teaching, that someone comes to the conclusion themselves. Or maybe you're wrong, right? So if I'm like, okay, if I'm talking to someone and it's like, you know, should we, and they're like, we need to focus on, I'm going to make this up, someone who's very wealthy, Jack Dorsey, right? Like we should be focusing all our efforts on getting a meeting with Jack Dorsey. No one knows this person, right? So, you know, like this person, and it's very hard to speak up. And so then it would be, well, does it make sense for us to spend all of our time and energy, you know, getting an introduction to this person who has a lot of people that are, you know, that are probably asking the same thing? Or, you know, should we also be talking to the five people who, you know, are also our biggest investors and givers? And what, you know, is there a downside to us focusing all of our attention on someone we don't know? And so we pose the question to someone who might be not so receptive to this type of information. It's like, I could learn information and could totally be wrong. And like, my opinion can change, and this isn't about being right or wrong. Or two, like, then they get to realize it on their own. And so this is where questions become a really important source of, well, questions in general are really certain important source of power, but in those rooms in particular. And also when you're talking about really tough things, like I just really lean into the obvious. So for example, and I think this, you know, when we're talking about how do we phrase things, I'm very upfront. I'm like, I know that you're the one that's paying me. Like, I know that you're the one with all the money, but how I view this is that we both have something to bring to the table. And so by just stating the dynamic in the room and sort of the pink elephant in the room, it allows for more things to come up. It allows the nerves to settle and to have and allow for real conversation. And then also, you know, basic things, but like be professional, right? So, you know, if you're not showing up on time, like that's going to say something, you know, be prepared, like all of this. And I'll say, and this isn't in here, but something that's really important is the importance of follow-up. Relationships are built in follow-up. And so if you do not follow up specifically and quickly, then that relationship gets lost. And it's amazing how few people do that. And the thing that's actually the hardest to do, that I think the fewest people do, is do what you say. You know, that's sort of like the easiest to say, hardest to execute, because it's just this constant accountability on myself. But with that said, if I'm the person, or if you're the person that always does what you say you're going to do, you are money, because you are rare and always in demand. Because it is so hard to find people that do what they say. Mm-hmm. And that also builds trust. And so this is where we're going to talk about pattern recognition and sort of how we repeat ourselves. And this is when, I think this is going to help Nina with the point of if someone isn't very clear in what their needs are, how am I able to assess what I'm working with? And so there behind this screen are stars, like and they repeat, and that's actually with a purpose. And so, if I were to take a small slice of this slide, and it could be like the lower left-hand corner, let's say, you could probably figure out what the rest of the pattern looked like, because the essence of a pattern is that it repeats. And we repeat because ultimately we're part of nature, and nature is in divine proportion to itself, and it repeats. And this is, there's this thing called fractal geometry, and I am not a mathematician, but I do know that there are no straight lines in nature. And so if I want to figure out, the dimensions of a coastline, I can't use normal geometry. I have to use fractal geometry, because even though there are no straight lines, everything is in proportion to itself. So you just need a very small piece of it, understand its proportionality, and then amplify it out. In the same way that if I were to eat a bite of cake, do I need to eat the whole cake to know what it tastes like? No, I can know if I'll get a lot of information from whether it's vanilla or chocolate, or like, is it whipped cream or fudge? Is it burnt? Like, I don't need to eat the whole cake, but I can if I want to, because maybe it's my birthday and maybe it's just Tuesday and I'm in the mood for cake. But it's up to me, based on what I get from that very small slice, to understand if I want the whole piece. And so we repeat. So for example, like, does this person come? And I will say we have bad days, and I think it's really important to show grace to people. And we also show up in big and small ways. And if we can pick them up in the small ways, then we have more intelligence on whether or not someone is the right fit for us. So for example, pay attention. Does this person, are they late or are they early? Are they hard to get in touch with? Do they respond right away? Do they ask you how you're doing? They're giving you so much information and insight into who you are, into who they are. So for example, in terms of like a small piece is a big piece. I used to have a lot of typos in my emails. You could learn just from those typos in my emails that I move too quickly. You can also notice that I speak rather quickly. And so there's this, what I've had to learn is how to slow down, how to take my time, how to not move, how to be strategic. And we give away ourselves, and it's fine. It's just about observing, acknowledging, and quite frankly, it could be, okay, well, this person might be really tough to tie down, and I'll have to like email them and text them a lot, but you know what, like, they're a really cool person, they get what I'm doing, and they have money. Like, but know that they're not going to change. And so the sooner we understand what we're dealing with, the more we can make intelligent decisions on whether or not we want to partner with that person and what that partnership could look like. And so
I love that you keep calling it a partner. I love that, as opposed to saying, I want this person to be a donor. Like, it's such a power shift to say, do I want to partner with this person? Are they the right person to help support what I'm doing, as opposed to that needy place of I need, and therefore I feel disempowered, and they seem to have all the power.
Well, and it's also, does that person want to just be like a bank account? Like, I think partner, and money brings everything to this. It's very clear who cuts a check. I'll just say, you learn a lot in this process of fundraising. And so, we all want connection. And so this is just a way of like, how are we building that trust? Ultimately the financial entity that like gives people long-term security, a trust. And so how are we creating that long-term security? So I do like send out monthly communication all around relationship building. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm happy to put that in the chat. If
we do have a question about maximizing time throughout a high caliber person meeting? How do you impress them and maximize? But I think you touched on that a little. Be professional, be prepared, right? All those things that you said.
So
Yeah.
the most important thing is to listen. So when I actually start off a conversation with someone, I make sure that I don't speak initially. I say, you know, tell me your story. Tell me what you do, why you chose to do this work, or how you ended up here. Because so much of this is about disarming the other person. And this is also, disarming the other person is very important when it comes to repairing relationships. But how do you soften an individual so that they're receptive?
Mm-hmm. And so what are the tips for softening? Is that just about finding connection? Is that about finding where by listening, you figure out where it is you might begin to see a partnership forming? Is that sort of the idea?
Well, it's also, yeah, listening, you get a lot of information, you ask follow-up questions, but so many people if they're in a conversation with like an investor of some kind, they have a guard up. And so people are immediately more interested in you once they've spoken about themselves.
I read a great psychological study that said that if you ask people questions about themselves, like in a job interview, they assume that you're really intelligent, right? They immediately, by showing an interest in them, they put all these positive attributes on you, which I thought was very interesting.
And there's also a very popular adage in fundraising, which is, if you want money, ask for advice. And if you want advice, ask for money. And so, you know, so many conversations just come from tell me how you got here. And someone's then invested in you, because so much of this is, how are we building investment? Mm-hmm. And so, yes, there's the professional aspects of like, show up on time, confirm it, follow up, and make sure, be like, you know, I actually don't want to, I say, like, I don't want to start off this conversation with me talking like I'm actually really curious. And I say curious because by just saying that I'm curious, it actually, you know, this is how words happen. It ends up making me more curious. And so I say, you know, I'm so curious, like, I know from, you know, we were connected through, I'm making this up, Julian, and that you spent some time abroad. I'm so curious, you know, what caused you or inspired you to come back home? Mm-hmm. Tell me about that. And so by just starting with them and getting their story, there's so much information. And then also, I've been in meetings where, let's say I'm having a conversation where there's money involved. If I ask them so many questions and then time is up, they're like, oh my God, we have to do this again. They're like, I'm so sorry, I didn't ask about you. And let me tell you, if they don't ask about you and like they've been talking the whole time, that's a lot of information for you.
Mm-hmm. Tells you a lot. Yeah.
Tells you a lot about that person.
So we have time for a couple more questions. If anyone else wants to drop anything in the chat. I know my perspective has shifted already. Or do we have any last questions for Wendy? Or does Wendy have any last pieces of advice for us? Oh, wait here. Can you please comment on the following? When people or organizations ask me for my Monday, I respond by offering them my labor. That leaves them speechless most of the time, but it tells me whether they need a partner. How would you respond to me if you came to me for money and I offered you my labor?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really curious about, I'd be really curious about your relationship to money. Because I will say, like, nonprofits, like how they function is money, but money isn't everything. And also money, I would need to know more about your specific skill set. So there are certain skills that nonprofits really need or for-profits really need. And so I don't know what that would be. I don't know your background. But there's sort of this balance, both and mentality of like, yes, money isn't everything, and everything runs on money. And so if it's something that you always do, and that this is something that I would be curious if that's like you never give money and you only give labor, or it's something that just happens once in a while.
Right. So he says, yeah, right. My response to them aims to tell me how honest they are about their mission. What are they really asking for? Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, like some places genuinely their need is money. Others might need labor, right? So it's a question of what they actually need too, right?
Yes.
Not just what you're offering.
Yeah, because if I'm focused on soup kitchens, like they can use volunteers really well. Like if they're that's a great use for volunteers and labor. There are other organizations where having people come in it just adds problems and adds a lot of time that a lot of team members don't have. And so look, I think giving your time is honestly the most valuable thing you can give, because it's the one thing that's unrenewable.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, companies need money, nonprofits in particular.
What their need is, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
and so if you're like, okay, I'm just not going to give money, that's just not my thing. That's that's also information for you on like, okay, then I shouldn't be working with organizations that don't need volunteers.
Yeah.
Because that's their business model.
Okay. So we have one last comment, more of a comment from Hermione, which is, it sounds like you prevent losing your soul by being true to yourself, which I think I would agree with that. It's like knowing you're like, not just being true to yourself, but really doing the work to drill in on what that means to be true to yourself, what it is that you need, what your relationship is to money, how that relationship might interfere with your ask, right? And so I think it's not just about being true to yourself, but it's about doing the work to really understand what that means, right? And where you might be getting in your own way.
Definitely. And I think that's, our souls, I mean, are the purest part of us. And so how do you tap into something that is fully you? Because at least from my experience, when I'm fully myself and I get like, okay, no, this isn't right, it is clear. It is so clear. And that is actually like a thank you. Okay, now I know where to go. Versus if I'm, like trying to hamper down a piece of myself, then it's always like, oh, but there are just less questions on where to go next.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes harder where to go next because I'm filtering myself.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, like, I want you to get what you want. I want you to wake up and be like, I feel joy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not going to happen when we miss pieces of ourselves every day.
I love that. I really want to just highlight that, because I so believe in being joy driven in work and purpose driven. And I think that, obviously any job, any work is going to have, drudgery and disappointment. But I do believe that if you can find the joy, which really comes from aligning with yourself and your own purpose and what you need and what's going to make you happy. I mean, I just feel that's better for everyone. The work is better, you're happier, everything is better. And so I think that, like that starting from that basis of joy of like, how am I going to determine joy? I really love that. How am I going to?
Thank you, Nina. And also, like, none of this is, this has been said before, it's really, I truly believe in learning from a lot of different teachers. And like, maybe something I say sticks, maybe there's one thing and that's what you take with you. But, people have been studying what does it mean to find joy and how do I get what I want for as long as we've been around, as long as there have been humans. There's something I think about quite a lot, which is, and I can't remember who said this, but if you want to know the answer to something that's very human, look back, because people have been doing this for a while. But if your question is quite contemporary, find the most up-to-date experts. So if I'm asking like, what is AI going to mean for my mental health? Look at an article that was just written yesterday by the person that's the expert on that. But if it's about what do I have to do to find joy? People have been writing about that for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. There's so much knowledge out there, and I'm just here to be of service, and hopefully something I've said today sticks with you.
Well, I think that's great. I see there's one more question, but I don't know if this is really within the scope of it, which is about the statistic was seen only 40% of nonprofit funding goes to the mission.
Oh, okay. I'm happy to answer this.
And how do you respond to people to tell us that fundraising is more self-serving than mission centered? So, okay, so let's talk about that. That'll be our last question of the evening.
So I think there's a real big judgment around money should go to programs, or money should go, which is like the work, and the money should go to operations, which is paying the people. And this is something that only happens in nonprofits. In for-profits, it's like most of the money goes to the operations. And look, and so it's a both and, like, yes, the money should be going, it needs to be transparent, and it needs to go to where it says it's going. At the same time, one of the huge challenges in nonprofits is burnout and people being underpaid and not being able to get great talent. And also, you can only hire people that might have savings because the pay isn't good. And then you have this gap in representation within these organizations. And so after being in for-profits and nonprofits, I find that that split, quite frankly, that split is something that people in finance, usually funders in finance, like really want to see. But it's also, I find that people, once they get closer to the work and they know how things work from the inside out, they're less tied to that number, because they want great people. Because also they want great people to be putting the work forward. And nonprofits, the goal is to be out of business, and it's about collaborating. So I would actually say it's less about what are you paying that person, and more about how are we as a group of organizations collaborating to fill in the gaps that government can't at the moment.
Okay.
Did I answer that? Was that helpful?
Again, I will not have turned the chat, but I think so. And if kids speak for everyone, although, might like to, but well, I want to thank you, Wendy, for your time and all this wisdom. You've certainly given me a lot to think about, and I hope the people who attended today as well. And we will send out the recording to everyone who attended or registered, and it will live on our YouTube channel. And so if you missed it, if you came in late, you missed the beginning, you'll get a recording. And thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you learned some stuff, and I know I did.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your night.
Great having you. Thank you, Wendy. Bye.
Bye.